The live stream is up. We can disable the waiting room. And we can unmute the main. Good. Thanks. Okay, welcome everyone to Concordia University's ForSpace. But thank you so much for joining us for the final event of the Commons, a week-long residency exhibition series co-hosted with the Milieu Institute for Arts, Culture, and Technology. But thank you for coming to today's event, which is titled, "If You Don't Like the Game, Change the Rules." And it's a launch of an alternative modes of video game production white paper that's co-authored by Michael Iantorno and Marie LeBlanc Flanagan. But to help situate you, we're streaming live to YouTube from ForSpace, and we are located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And here at ForSpace, we work with the university community, mobilizing knowledge, creating events, trying to find ways to make what happens at Concordia more public. We're running this hybrid event as a Zoom meeting as well. So any comments or questions via raised hand or the chat on Zoom. For those of you in this space, of course, just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. And with that, it is very much my pleasure to pass the microphone over to Michael Iantorno. Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Montreal launch of If You Don't Like the Game, Change the Rules, Alternative Modes of Video Game Production. You might notice there's some documents and fun stuff floating around the room. We have a white paper in both English and French, and also versions of the comic where you're welcome to take a copy and look through it. In fact, I encourage you to kind of skim through both documents so you can pose questions to us during the panel discussion a little bit later. I'm also going to share my screen right now. Oh, except of course the Zoom isn't working. Here we go. And on the screen, you're going to see, if I can get it to work. There we go. A QR code and a link. And this is basically the landing page for the project. And if not right now, then very soon, there are going to be PDF versions of both the comic and the white paper available there. So this is especially important to people who are joining us online who can't have the physical copies. They'll be able to access it right there. And that page will stay stable for a long period of time. So you'll always be able to find it there. We're going to talk about both the comic and the white paper in a moment. But first, we're going to be doing some introductions.
Well, I'm using a new fancy microphone for the first time. Is it sounding okay? Am I good? Yeah. Yeah, so thanks, Michael. Today, as Michael said, we're celebrating the launch. It's been a long time coming. We've been working on it for a year, and here are some of our star players. So I'm going to introduce people. So first of all, introduce myself. As it is in my notes, my name is Marie LeBlanc Flanagan. I make experimental video games, and I worked on this project with a number of people. Over here, we have Michael, who is working with Concordia University. And we have Jess Marcotte here from Soft Chaos. Welcome. And Celine Dubois from Co-op. And Carolyn Jung from Game Workers Unite and Vodio Games. So we're going to be providing a broad overview of the project today. We're not going into great detail about anything. You can read it later. And most of this event will be an open conversation on unions, worker cooperatives, and labor in the Canadian games industry. We're happy to answer any questions you have about the comic and white paper. And we also invite you to take this time to talk to these incredible people who are here to talk to you about their experiences in the co-op and union space. And we're hoping that our panelists will bring up any topics they want also in this room. So take us where you want to go. And I'll pass it back to Michael for some acknowledgements.
Yeah, as Marie mentioned, we've been working on this project for a long time, and it really wouldn't have come together without the support of a lot of organizations and different people. And I actually skipped the slide there. There we go. Yeah, with a lot of different people. So I just want to lead off with some thank yous and some acknowledgements, kind of the official credits for the paper and the comic. So we first like to recognize that If You Don't Like the Game, Change the Rules has been facilitated by Game Arts International Network, with Marie serving as project lead, as well as writing and authoring the comic, and Jim Monroe providing project management and dissemination support. And I just want to thank them both personally for inviting me onto the project as the white paper lead author. It's been a thrill to work on this project for the last year and a half.
Can we get a wave from Jim? Oh, you do.
We'd also like to acknowledge the financial contributions from the Canada Media Fund, Ontario Creates, and MyTax. Our beautiful page layouts were completed by Christian Scott at Mutual Design and Double Graphico, and we were able to pay for the layouts with a project grant from the Technoculture Art and Games Lab right here at Concordia. You'll also notice that we have a full French translation of the white paper, which was put together by Justin Leduc-Frenette and Luc Languille. And we also received research assistance from Hanine Elmer, who is also here, Christian Scott and Ermac Tanner, particularly in facilitating interviews, surveys, and contributing to the annotated bibliography and our initial search for unions and co-ops in the game industry. Salim and Jess both consulted on the project, so we thank them for keeping us on track. And we really wanted to extend a special thanks to Mia Consalvo, Osama Dorius, Rami Ismail, and Phelan Parker for advising on the project, providing logistical support, and contributing in a bunch of other different ways.
So what is this thing? Why are you here? Do people know why you're here? Do you know what we're talking about today? I got a little hand if you do have some idea of what we're here for. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you for coming if you didn't know. That's very kind. So broadly speaking, if you don't like the game, Change the Rules, it was a research project. We were curious to explore the Canadian game industry, also internationally, using surveys and interviews. So we talked to people and then we also surveyed them anonymously. And the goal was to explore the state of worker co-ops, which there's a lot of curiosity. There's a lot of buzz happening right now and has been happening for a long time and is really swelling in games and unions in the Canadian game industry, which is a hot potato and a hot word. So one of our main goals for this project was to determine why game devs, if you read the white paper, you'll see what we mean by game devs, why game devs may be swayed towards or away from worker co-ops, unions, and other labor structures. So a lot of this work was exploring, I'm really interested in challenges. What's broken? What's hard? Why is it difficult? So we did a lot of work exploring challenges and also exploring benefits. Talking to people in co-ops, why is it working for them? Why is it working for you? Talking to people who are forming unions, why is that working for them? Why are they curious about that? And how that fits into the broader game development ecosystem. So we also treated it as an opportunity to get a kind of a clearer picture of the entire labor landscape in the Canadian game industry. Talking to people about things like burnout. Does anyone know about burnout? Yeah, personally, you don't have to do it. So, yeah, burnout, crunch, and harassment, these things that many of us have experienced and are unfortunately common. So throughout the project, we were working towards two main outputs. So the comic, which maybe someone can hold up a copy. You don't have a copy. I don't have a copy. It's like the comic, which I'll talk about more later, but it's a fictionalized version of the research discussing game industry labor issues. And Michael took the lead on writing a white paper, which originally was going to be just this supplementary thing, but blossomed into a gorgeous, incredible research document. And yeah, it summarizes the findings of our research, and there's cool graphs and charts and quotes. So I'll pass it back to Michael to talk about how we did it.
Like many academics, I started to document and I thought it was going to be very small, and then it exploded. And also, like many academics, I feel compelled to give you a very in-depth outline of my methods. But I'll try to rein it in a little bit. So basically, me and Marie, we did the research for this project between June 2022 and January 2023. And it involved interviews and surveys with folks across the Canadian game industry. For the surveys, we recruited folks across Gain's existing networks. We used Twitter before Twitter was completely on fire, and we contacted a bunch of game studios directly. We asked survey participants to contribute their thoughts and their experiences on labor practices in the game industry, but also their kind of attitudes towards worker co-ops and unions. What did they know about them? Did they feel positively or negatively about them? And we received over 50 responses in these surveys. And a lot of the kind of quant crunchy data that you see throughout the white paper, the charts and stuff, we have sourced from these surveys. For the interviews, we sought out many different stakeholders across the game industry, active worker co-op members, game devs in the process of starting a co-op, and game studios that possessed co-op values, even if they weren't necessarily co-ops themselves. To help put together our questions and contextualize our research, we also spoke with a bunch of game union organizers, labor experts, and industry veterans who have unique insights on these topics. And the goal of these interviews was to get beyond like really surface level observations, stuff that we can kind of find in the news, and really dig into how co-ops and unions are created and maintained in the game industry. And although our focus was mostly in Canada, we did have the opportunity to speak with folks in the USA and some studios in Europe and South America as well. So while most of the people we talked to are here, we wanted to get more of a global perspective on things. And after we had collected all this data, we studied the survey and interview answers and coded them to establish some overarching themes. And this mainly involved organizing results under very interrogative headings. So when you look at the white paper, you'll see a lot of the sections are led up by questions that we think people might have about unions and co-ops and game labor. And we have tried to make this an easy way to kind of navigate the white paper and to get the information that you need. And I really feel like the comic and the white paper, they fit together like puzzle pieces. They're very, very different, but they're kind of part of the same thematic whole. And Marie's going to chat a little bit about the comic now.
Yeah, briefly. I'll briefly chat about the comic. We can talk more later. First, a question, who here works in the games industry very broadly? Can I see? Okay, and who does not work in the games industry at all? A pretty good split. All right, and then who here has struggled with work? Has or does struggle with work? I'm talking about like burnout, about feeling overwhelmed, about having a hard time. Okay, who here does not struggle with work? I saw one hand from the back. I mean, the comic is fictionalized, as I said, but it is absolutely not fiction. It is a direct reflection of what I heard in the interviews, what I hear in conversations with my friends, and my own experiences working in this industry, and working in general in this late capitalist environment that we're in. I was going to use a swear, but then might be a broad audience out there. Swears are okay. So, yeah, I mean, if you read the comic, you'll see, I would like you to know I have never gone on the toilet in a Zoom call. I've never been on a Zoom call on the toilet, but I've come close. And I feel like many of us are in this state where we're working so hard that it starts to make sense to be on the toilet in a Zoom call. And to be so distorted in our relationship to work that is breaking us. And when I started doing this research, like when I started thinking about doing a project like this, I think 2 years ago, I reached out to Salim first, and Salim was very supportive, and I was very curious about these incredible people who are starting co-ops, and people who are starting unions, and people who are taking charge of their own work environments and trying to make them better. And I know that things are complicated. Co-ops aren't perfect, unions aren't perfect, but they're both ways that we can make work better for us. And so with the comic, I was trying to explore two things. One, a snapshot of what I saw right now in the Canadian games industry, what I heard from people, what they're struggling with, what it looks like, through three main characters. One person who works at an unnamed small indie studio that eventually gets acquired by Booby Saft. One person who works as a freelancer and has terrible boundaries and has a magical talking cat that's trying to convince them to stop. And one person who comes from money and is a big dreamer and wants to change the world. A bit charmed life, but also struggles with interpersonal things. And I thought through these three characters, I could reflect what I saw in people and make this fictionalized story. And I'd love to hear from you if it works. Two more things I'll share about the comic and then I'll stop. One, I'd never made a comic before. I'd never even made a comic panel before, so it was a bit terrifying. I read all about comics and learned incredibly fascinating things like about the margin in between panels and how that's a space for change. And two, that the comic is a bit critical. I'm not very critical of unions in the comic, but I would say I'm very critical of co-ops, and for me, that's my love language. That's how I really show that I care about something and I'm invested, by picking at every single thing that I think could go wrong with it. Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is just a huge thanks to the people who we interviewed throughout the process, both formally and informally, and all my friends and collaborators who read drafts and supported and helped me find a way to tell the story. And I really welcome feedback, whether it reflects your experience or not. And yeah, thanks for listening to me. I'm going to hand it back to Michael to talk briefly about the white paper.
Yeah, once again, I'm not going to get too deep into things because we all have the document in hand. I welcome you to kind of read through it in your own time. But basically, the goal of the white paper is we had this enormous kind of pool of research, and we wanted to make it digestible and navigable and something that people who are in the industry or thinking about getting into the industry or people who are in academia in various contexts can pick up this white paper and can navigate it and can pull out information fairly easily. And I mentioned that we organize things under interrogative headings. So you'll notice that it's organized under questions, but broadly speaking, it's divided into 5 sections that I just want to kind of talk about to help you navigate it. So the first one is your standard white paper introduction. It has an executive summary. This is the part of the white paper that most people will read. And it has some key terms, which I think are useful throughout the white paper. Then we talk about game labor in Canada, based mostly on our survey results, talking about, what things people are excited about, what things people are worried about. And on both sides of that spectrum, on one side, we have long hours, poor wages, lack of creative freedom, employment security. And on the other side, we have some excitement, some hesitant excitement about things such as potential 4-day work weeks and remote and hybrid working arrangements, which came to the forefront during the pandemic. The second section is the state of video game worker cooperatives, which discusses, how aware people are of worker co-ops who are game developers, and the challenges and benefits that the current worker co-ops face. And this section is really rooted in our interviews with folks in the industry and discusses their trajectory of planning and starting and maintaining worker co-ops. And we also talk about some of the legal and jurisdictional and institutional peculiarities of registering and funding co-ops. The state of video game unions uses recent unionization efforts in Canada as a jumping off point for discussing the process of forming game studio unions. We're really in the early days of game studio unionization still in Canada, but we've gleaned a lot of insights from labor organizers and successful efforts at Anemone Hug and Keyword Studios in Canada. And in closing notes, we do make some recommendations for folks, and we also have some resources, a few pages of appendices that have anything from academic studies to videos and podcasts that can kind of further flesh out these ideas. And I'm not going to summarize beyond that, but I do want to pull out a few things I think are really interesting about the white paper. First, I love that folks, including folks at this table, gave us direct quotes. I feel like it adds a lot of context and a lot of emotion to a topic. It's really easy to have really dry writing on industry studies stuff, but to get these kind of personal accounts, I think adds another layer to it. And I just want to thank everybody who participated in the study for just being so candid with their answers. It's really hard to find information on things such as wages and hierarchies and social dynamics within studios. And I think that's one way that this white paper has succeeded in ways that I was just very excited about. And as I mentioned, we do have some recommendations at the end, and this might come up in the discussion, but I do think things are getting better, especially for co-ops in the game industry. Which is just something I'm kind of delighted with. Yeah,
so let's kick off our discussion. We've talked to you long enough. It's been wonderful. But yeah, now we're going to open it up. So for the rest of the panel, the rest of our time together, we're going to have an open discussion about game labor, union organization. If you're not in the games industry, we can also talk about work. I mean, these topics carry across industries. And worker co-ops, and how this all fits into the game industry. So people in the audience, you're very welcome to ask questions. You're encouraged, and both online and in person. How will the online people reach us?
I believe they'll be handled through, on their cameras or microphones. Yes, so you can jump in through the chat if you're online, or you can turn on your camera and microphone to ask questions as well. You'll be on a screen here, but so we'll be able to see and hear you. It's okay. It's very chill.
Pajamas are fine, but yeah, you can turn on your camera or just your microphone and ask questions.
And if folks in here want to ask questions, you can just raise your hand and we'll pass you a microphone.
Yeah. So, shall we begin? Shall we seed a question, Michael?
I will seed a question. Let's talk a little bit about momentum, because I think this is something we brought up with folks during our interviews originally. I mean, video game co-ops and unions, you didn't hear much about them, especially in the Canadian context until recently. What do you think the reason is that we're starting to see more now? And I know that's a broad question, so you can pick it apart. Would anybody here like to field that first? Excellent.
So I think, yeah, it is a complex question. I think there's a lot going on there. Some of that is kind of external factors, I would say, or broad societal factors, maybe economic factors, climate change factors, people just realizing that, there's problems in the world that are not currently being solved, and searching for solutions or some way to do something about that. So I think that's had an impact, obviously, not just in the games industry and a lot of other industries. We're seeing a big upswell in the labor movement here in Canada, in the US, and other places as well, that I think is partially triggered by that, right? Like people realizing, yeah, there are these problems and they're not getting better on their own. If anything, things are getting worse. It's getting harder and harder to just make a living, survive day to day. The future is looking pretty scary for a lot of folks. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it, right? It's just that historically we're in a moment where people are starting to wake up and stand up. I think also there's a lot of invisible work that happens that makes that momentum happen also, right? There's a lot of people doing a lot of work just talking, with their coworkers, with other people in their community about, what is possible, what are the problems, let's actually talk about them, come up with a plan, work together to do something about them. That doesn't just happen on its own. People have to make those conversations happen. Doing education work, right? I think when I started with Game Workers Unite Montreal, most people, myself included, did not really know how unions worked at all. We kind of heard about them, heard a lot of union busting myths, and kind of the sort of like background noise around unions was not even necessarily positive. But we educated ourselves. We put in the work to go, talk to local unions, figure out, what does this mean? What does this look like? How do we make this happen? And passed on that information to other folks as much as we could. And yeah, I think that over the course of, the last few years has really been a big part of like making that shift happen, right? And obviously not just us, it's been a whole lot of people doing that work. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Anyway, does anyone else want to jump in?
That's great. Before you jump in, I just want to, who here can define what a worker co-op is in a sentence? Anyone? Do people know what a worker co-op is? Yeah, okay, we got a volunteer back there. Oh, do we have to do okay, that's a journey, okay. Okay, I'm good. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page as we're talking about these things.
I think I'm cheating a bit because I'm a member of the same organization Carolyn is a member of, but yeah, a worker co-op is a business, a workplace that is fully operated and owned by the people who work there, right? So as opposed to a more non-cooperative business where you have people who are owners and people who just work there, who are employees and do not have any real ownership stake in the company, a worker co-op has a sort of democratic structure where everyone who works at the company is a member and an owner of the company.
Perfect. Yeah, and you can read definitions in the white paper and comic too, but yeah, owned and controlled by the workers. Okay, same thing, but for unions. Anyone? Someone want to say what a union is? Could be one of our speakers too. Yeah.
I can try. A union is very similar to a cooperative, but it doesn't need to exist within a cooperative. It could exist within a normal company. So people have rights, they have salaries that are agreed upon, they have a say in their work and in the decisions that the company takes, but they exist within a company that has a power hierarchy.
Wonderful. Yeah, great. Anyone else want to add to that? You want more? Yeah.
So just to add to that, there are lots of different kinds of unions. So you don't necessarily have to have a union that's only within one company. You could have unions that are for a particular kind of trade or skill, or, there's just lots of different ways of approaching unionization. So, maybe you might not think that it makes sense for your company to be part of a union, but maybe, based on your skills, your trade, you might want to form a different kind of union. So yeah, just want to add to that.
Yeah, and I think really critically, the thing about unions is that the purpose of the union is to collect the workers under sort of collective to be able to have power against the business owners and to represent the workers' rights and needs. It's very much a specifically a thing about power, and it's a way for people to organize against the imbalance of power that exists in most workplaces and labor under capitalism.
Quickly add for context, so specifically in Canada, because labor law obviously differs from place to place, the way that you form a union is you organize with other coworkers. You, in Quebec specifically, actually are able to do something called card check. So if you get 50% plus one of your, it could be the entire company, could be a specific subset of workers with shared working conditions within that company, to all vote in favor of a union, then you are officially recognized by the government, and you can then go to the next step of essentially bargaining with the employer, right? To have a say, like you mentioned, in your working conditions, set the terms. And that is the sort of like legal route. But there is also, I think, that core that everyone has been pointing to of like it's workers coming together and organizing for their own interests and building power together. And I think that that's universal and that doesn't that's not constrained by labor law. But I just wanted to add that detail because it does differ from place to place in terms of like how you go through that process legally.
And if I may add, one of the challenges we actually had with this project was that since co-ops and unions are based around labor laws, those can change a lot between jurisdictions. So we talked to people and we're like, why is this information somewhat contradictory? It's like, well, one person's in Alberta and one person's in Quebec. So it makes a huge difference. And it's really hard to kind of summarize these experiences when they're shaped by all different types of legislation. At the back of the white paper, we do have some regional resources, and maybe this is skipping ahead in the discussion, but if folks are interested in these labor structures, there are always regional organizations that you can reach out to that can help you and with the nuances of where you're situated.
Yeah. Before this project, I understood unions at big organizations. Okay, so like a huge auto plant has a union. Or like I worked briefly with the CBC, there was a union. I didn't understand that like 3 people who works on a festival can unionize together. I didn't understand that unionization is kind of possible anywhere. And that was exciting for me. And another thing I didn't understand was worker co-ops. That there's Mountain Equipment Co-op, for example, was a consumer co-op. It wasn't a worker co-op. And that distinction is really important. And I want to go back to our important questions too, but I want to make sure we're all talking about the thing. And all questions are valid here. And I do see there's a question back there. Yeah. Well, probably the online people can't. So yeah, thanks.
There's something really interesting also about union, is that it's not only in your like cooperation or in your work, is that once you're unionized legally, you get to go to other people's union and stand up together in other people's workplaces, and they're not alone, and it's like feeding each other off. And that's what I find really interesting in what you guys are doing, because we feel that it's not just one environment, it's several different environments together, even though they don't know each other and they don't have the same kind of rules, and then get together and stand up with each other.
Absolutely.
Great. So back to our questions. We're a little derailing over here, but yeah, please, actually, if you don't know something, if someone says something like Game Workers Unite, and you're like, what is that? You can just kind of go like this a bit, and I'll know that you're asking for this kind of help rather than like, I have a question. So yeah, let's continue on with the wave question. Why is it growing? It was you, Salim, sorry.
Well, so I think I just wanted to add and really emphasize what Carolyn was saying, especially about infrastructure. I think, unions are more popular now than they have been in a really long time, but what you do with that energy is really critical, and creating a kind of infrastructures, things like Game Workers Unite, discords, organizations, meetings, to allow for those frustrations, to allow for those people to have an outlet and to start finding each other to organize, is why I think we're seeing such this wave that's happening right now. I think it's because there are like an army of people who are volunteering their time and their effort to make it happen. It's not an accident. It's through labor. That's all.
And I guess on the co-op side of things, locally, I think it's hard to be first, right? And it's hard if you don't have people to ask questions of. So again, this works for unions too. having organizations where you can ask those questions and where they can tell you about pitfalls and help you through those structures is enormously helpful. And I think that, you know, in my case, when we were forming our union, there were like 1.5 video game co-ops in Quebec because, you know, co-op mode transition. And so it was like, okay, you know, the other co-ops helped us. We were able to speak to them and they were able to help us through different processes and be like, you know, this is what our, you know, contracts look like. And this is like what our paperwork looked like. This is what it was like to work with this organization. You know, this is who to talk to. And that was enormously helpful. So I think, you know, the more role models we have, the more we'll see like an increase in this wave. And I think that's part of what we're seeing too.
And just to add on that, the sort of role model idea, I really think there's been a bit more of a press pickup to cover these topics over the last year or two. A lot of people mention co-ops and they mention that they found them through gaming news websites, which I think are sort of notorious for not being great at covering games labor. So even in a small dose, I think that we are seeing some more public-facing materials for these. And when people see them, what a lot of our participants mentioned, there's like, oh, that's a real thing that can happen. And I'm excited about it. And it seems much more possible than it did before. Now that I see a news story, I see someone talking about it in a podcast, et cetera, et cetera.
Can I just jump on that for
Yes.
a second? Because that does also remind me of another thing that I think contributed, which is that a lot of those journalists and folks working for those outlets actually unionized before the games industry got going. And I think that played a big role, right? And like why they suddenly started, you know, feeling comfortable enough be able to write articles about labor issues, right? Because if you're not unionized yourself, maybe you're worried, you know, how is my boss going to react to this if I suddenly start taking an interest in unions and want to write about that or want to write about bad working conditions. So yeah, it gave them the security, the personal, you know, firsthand experience and what that meant. And yeah, I think those two things really work together. And it's a great example also of what the other audience member mentioned about like, you know, yeah, like different movements in different industries all kind of work together and help build each other up. And that solidarity, I think, is really critical in where our strength comes from ultimately.
Where our strength comes from is so good. Powerful. Okay, question for the audience. Who in the audience is in a union? Oh, very sparse. It's like a little half hand. Who wants to be in a union? Okay, well, a lot of hands. Whoa, yeah, okay. Okay, interesting. Who is or has been in a co-op, a worker co-op? Well, 2 hands? Okay, and who wants to be in a co-op? Some curiosity, some half hands. Okay, okay, good. We can go back to normal. I just keep wanting to check in with you. And I want you to remember that you can ask questions. We have a list of questions, but if there's a question burning in your heart, you should put up your hand. Michael, do you want to seed another question?
I saw a half hand over there, or was that a fake out?
A question.
So I hear a lot about management's opposition to unions and trying to stop unionization from happening. Do you think like the owners' fears are right? Like, are they right to be afraid and upset?
Yeah, if you didn't hear that, the answer from Salim was yes, but I mean, I think, you know, the reason, one of the reasons why there is a lot of pushback from management is you know, the profits of the company are ultimately coming from the labor of their workers, right? And so if those workers are suddenly like, hey, we don't feel like we're getting our fair share, like we're producing all of this value for this company, you know, all these profits, and we're not seeing any of that in turn, you know, maybe our wages are getting worse, we're losing health benefits, et cetera, where what's happening here, you know, that threatens the bottom line of the company. And, you know, generally in a capitalist society, you know, companies are created to produce a profit for the owners. And so, yeah, there's a direct kind of economic conflict there, right? There's a conflict of interests between the owners and the workers. I think also some of it is like a fear of losing control, right? There's a big aspect of like, if you're in management, if you're an owner, you are kind of put in this position where you have kind of life or death power over the people who work under you, right? Like you get to decide, Can they, you know, pay their rent and buy food and stuff at the end of the day or not? That's a pretty, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, but you've kind of got a gun to their heads in a way. And so I think for a lot of people, you know, where that's the position that they're in, when all of a sudden they don't have complete say over, you know, what the working conditions are going to be in that environment, or over, you know, how this project is going to go, et cetera. That's a scary thought to them because they're not used to that kind of, oh, it's a dialogue now. It's like, I don't just have to dictate the terms. So yeah, I think that those are the two reasons I have seen that really fuel a lot of that pushback. And yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the capitalist system that we live in. And it's helpful for us as workers to just recognize that, right? And to be like, okay, well, how do we deal with that? We deal with that by, you know, building our power on our side and really trying to come to the table as equals so that, you know, we're not in this unequal relationship, right? So yeah, hopefully that helps.
I just want to add to emphasize the control point that Caroline brought up is that fundamentally most management does not believe the workers should have that control. Like fundamentally, it is core to the identity of management that they make those decisions, not workers. And so, of course, they're scared shitless about anything that would threaten that kind of power, right? Because they don't believe that that power should be split or shared or distributed in any different way. I'm the owner, I put in my capital, I took all the risk, this is my venture, you work for me. That is fundamental to a lot of the opinions and perspectives that you see coming from people who oppose unionization.
So yeah, I think that Carolyn and Salim have done a really, really great job of explaining why owners of companies are scared. I think like, the thing about this is that like there are some benefits to companies having unions too, if you're not being extremely short-sighted. Like if you have to retrain new labor every 3 years. So, okay, I thought a few years ago that the average career in the game industry was 5 years, but then somebody who's been in the industry 25 years was like, oh no, it's 3. It's 3 years. Like most people stay 3 years and then they're out of here. And so in a nutshell, like, we're seeing some games right now that have been in production for a very long time with teams that have been together working for a very long time, like a decade or more. And, those games are really good and they're really nice. And everyone really likes them. And like, why reproducing that kind of game is extremely challenging if your workforce is changing every 3 years. So I think there are benefits to having healthier workers that are just about like, not looking beyond like, this like profit for the year or like this short-term gain. Yeah, anyway, but yes. Owners do have a reason to be afraid, and yes, they will probably have to give up some control, and maybe CEOs won't make 300 times what their workers make. Oh no.
But I will say, we did speak to at least one person in our interviews who said they encouraged, it was a co-op, they encouraged their workers to unionize. So it's not unheard of for a boss to want people to unionize. If we're not, I mean, the problem is that the current economic structure, we're supposed to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger forever. But if that's not the goal, then it can just be kind of a equal, there's a reality where a boss could welcome the union. I just want to say it doesn't happen very often, but it did happen in at least one of our interviews, and it could happen again.
And the idea of sort of studio sustainability came up a lot in our discussions. So this idea of like, we don't want to chase exponential growth forever and eventually sell off the studio. We want to find a way that we can slowly grow or slowly maintain this studio and produce the types of games we want to make and not worry about having a big crash or like big crashes and booms all the time necessarily, although there's some of that built into the game industry by nature. So maybe we can turn to the topic of sustainability. And, I think this is particularly interesting in the co-op space because a lot of co-ops in Canada are still very young. We haven't really seen one lasting more than 10 years, I don't think. Maybe not even that long.
In games.
In games, sorry. There are lots of co-ops that have lasted otherwise. Thank you for that correction. In-game co-ops. So I'm going to turn to the folks who are in the game co-op space and ask them, what do they think sustainability can look like for a co-op?
Well, I think like the first like sort of baseline information I would give is that co-ops are more likely to survive their infancy, I guess, than traditional businesses. Like more likely by far. I'm not going to name a stat because I'm sure I'll get it wrong, but I think it's like it's really up there. And so to me, like one of the reasons that I wanted to start a co-op and like what I think sustainability could look like is like just like being able to provide for the workers, like just being able to provide in at times when workers may need rest, at times when things may be difficult, like at times when we're in like, you know, a pandemic and like a mass disabling event, being able to like let the people in my co-op take a break or, you know, being there to like catch them and like to support each other is a big part of what sustainability looks like for me.
I think if I sat down over a beer and told you the exact history of co-op, there's a game studio that I did I press something? I'm back. You would be like, wow, there's no way that that studio should have survived this long. And I think that it only has survived because of its co-op nature. And I think that that's because we're all basically, I don't think our co-op mode, the studio, is sustainable. We've basically been bankrupt from our first project and we've always been chasing funding. So we've been very lucky to survive and to be able to make games for this long. But I wouldn't call it sustainable. I think sustainability only exists if you aren't chasing after the market pressure and like the changes and like constantly trying to find funding in whatever way you can in this capitalist hellscape. But because we're in this together and because we share everything together and most essentially we share our profits with each other, there's a group of people who are very dedicated, who want to see this thing succeed and want to see this thing provide sustainability for themselves and for their other workers. And that kind of collective goal and vision for the studio helps make things a lot more manageable when things are hard.
I just want to say that I think one thing that came out in both of your responses is that like one big difference with the worker co-op, right, is that the workers are the owners. So there's not that conflict of interest because it's essentially the same people. And so that's, I think, yeah, that structural change is really what helps put the interests of the workers at the forefront, as opposed to it being the kind of profit driven, you know, like we've got to, and there's still obviously the realities of the market. So, and I think you can't really talk about sustainability within capitalism because capitalism is unsustainable fundamentally. It's not going to last forever, which is a hopeful thing too, I think. But I think, yeah, in terms of what provides some semblance of longevity or security within that, then yeah, I think it is, you know, the people performing the labor also being part of that decision-making process, right? And also making the shots about like, hey, how can we keep this up for as long as possible? And yeah, how do we make sure that we can pay the bills and, you know, feed ourselves as opposed to enriching some shareholders who, you know, have nothing to do with us. So, yeah.
I just want to add on the reason capitalism isn't sustainable, in my opinion, and maybe you have other opinions, but it's because it asks for infinite growth when we have finite resources. So when we say it's not sustainable, we're not just saying it's not sustainable. We have reasons.
Another thing is when you have a group of workers organized and working together, when there is some toxic bullshit or some sort of mismanagement or abuse or just stuff that you basically don't want to put up with, you can come together and actually change those conditions because you have that kind of power. And I think that goes a really long way to creating a work environment that is safe and secure for a group of people. And that, like, in the 10 years that I've been doing this, only one person has left our studio who's a full-time worker. And I think that that's a really good sign and track record of like what the environment means to the people that work within it.
I have a question online, but would anybody like to ask a follow-up question on these topics of sort of sustainability in the game industry, the co-op and the union space? I see a hand at the back.
I have a question, but it's not related to sustainability. Should I save it for the end?
No, go ahead right now.
Okay. It's kind of a tangent to the previous question that was before this. I was curious if there's you have reflections or the research had any reflections on whether becoming part of a worker co-op or becoming part of a union or starting a union yourself, specifically being part of that initiation process, had any impact on other parts of people's lives in terms of the power and agency they feel in their own life, thinking of like, you know, should the boss be afraid? And yes, I'm thinking of the nonprofit world that I come from. It's like, that's not necessarily that it's like there's this profit aspect maybe, but I find that hierarchical relationality is the default. So it's almost the unknown that people are afraid of. So how does it kind of impact people's other aspects of lives besides work? If you've heard any reflections on it.
I mean, I think it's hard to exist in a structure without it shaping your thinking. So like for me, I think the things that I've learned from worker co-ops and like the ways that the things I've learned about myself and the ways that I like to work, those are things that I've carried into like, you know, domestic labor and like other areas too. You know, and like, I don't know, I feel like yes, but in like this sort of like whole worldview shift way. It's like, once I start to learn about unions and co-ops, it's like, you know, I think about prices differently. And like, you know, I think about like the gig economy, and I think about, you know, the people that I might be paying to do things, and whether like, you know, what they're asking for is fair or whether I should be doing better by them. And yeah, again, like, you know, managing labor in my own household with my spouse and my cats. The cats are terrible at this, you know, just, yeah, it definitely has shaped like a lot of thinking about other areas in my life for sure. Yeah.
I just want to say, people at the back, there are some seats at the front and the camera won't be on you. So you can just sit there if you want. We won't look.
Yeah, I promise it's less scary than sitting up here. So please feel free. So yeah, I would say it's a great question. I think that the process of organizing is honestly, in some ways, one of the most transformational aspects, right, of union organizing or forming worker co-ops. I have seen in myself and in others just incredible transformations, like building confidence, building the sense that, like, you know, if there is a problem, I don't just have to accept it and like go along with it or be like, oh, there's nothing I can do or it's too hard. It's like, no, I can actually do something about it. I can talk to people about it. We can build power. We can come up with solutions and we can do something. And I think that kind of sense of like, yeah, power and agency is just incredibly transformative when we are so often taught, as, you know, as workers, to just sort of like put your head down and do what you're told and, you know, follow the rules. And if you work really hard, you know, maybe one day you'll, I don't know, have a house or something. Maybe not so much anymore, but that used to be the idea. And yeah, I think that process of knowing that, like, yeah, you can take things into your own hands and do something about it, and seeing that concretely in front of you, right? It's not just an idea, it's not something you read about, it's like something you do with other people and you see it happen. That changes people completely. And I think that's a really beautiful and yeah, inspiring thing about this work. And it's a lot of work, and it can be very scary. But yeah, facing up to those fears, I think, and taking that action, yeah, it's transformative. I don't know what else to say.
It's like that Erica Le Guin quote that I can't remember, so I'm gonna horribly mangle, but like, we've lived in capitalism for so long that it's hard to imagine that there's actually an alternative. And I think these sorts of alternative modes of production are all about showing you that another way is possible and challenging the things that you've been taught as natural. And that fundamentally changes you as a person.
Salim, I have a question for you specifically, because when Jess said this thing about having these values and then them coming into the rest of your life, have you experienced that too?
In what sense?
Well, I mean, like in a co-op, for example, controlling the work together democratically. And so Jess was talking about in like house labor, also thinking about that. How are we deciding who washes the dishes? Like, do you feel that it transformed you in a deep way?
I think that there's still so much of our society and things like masculinity and sexism that are still so ingrained deeply in every facet of our lives that needs to be challenged and needs to be unpacked. In my life personally, those have always been external factors that have challenged those things. And my work has mostly helped me understand other people's suffering more than anything else. But I would say that the most transformative experiences I've had have come from other people's experiences being shared with me and challenging my power or my structures that or my lived experiences that I wasn't considering.
That also makes me think about when I first talked to you about this project a long, long, long time ago. One of the reasons I was so curious about co-ops and unions was because many of the people who seemed to be leading the charge were people who were racialized, who were gender minorities, who were marginalized in one way or another. Like the people doing the most interesting work were coming from this positionality. And I'm curious if any of the three of you have perspectives on this, if you've noticed it, if it's meaningful to you.
Everyone in a co-op seems to be queer. That's what I've noticed, myself included.
Same, big same. Queerness is one of Soft Chaos's core values. Yeah, so I mean, like, I think all, like, in our case, like, all three of us are, you know, experience marginalization in different ways. And we're kind of at a point where we're like, you know, we've got nothing to lose. You know, like I was like finishing a degree and I'm like, it's gonna take 6 months to a year to get a job, probably. I may as well be forming a co-op. And then like I have, you know, some of our members are like neurodivergent. And they're like, the traditional game industry like is burning me out and it doesn't work for me. I don't know if a regular job will ever fit me. So, you know, what if I tried this other structure instead and see if it works? And yeah, so I think like, you know, there are ways in which we also had like a lot of privilege, but we were kind of like, you know, we may as well try this. We may as well see what happens. And we happen to have like a lot of support in Quebec, particularly. I think it's one of the easiest places to form a co-op. So we had a lot of support from people to get us where we needed to go to get started.
How long ago was that when you started?
So we started the process in, I guess, 2020, but we officially formed in May 2021. So we're just a little over 2 years old now.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely noticed this with union organizing work. It's that, yeah, the people who are the most marginalized, who are often at the kind of like bottom of the hierarchy and that sort of corporate ladder structure, yeah, are often the ones leading the charge, right? Because they really see the problems, they feel the problems, they live the problems. And so there's a lot of motivation there to try to do something about it. And I think, you know, myself, it's like the reason I got into union organizing was because of, you know, just seeing all of the shit that, in the games industry in terms of, yeah, the sexism, the racism, the homophobia, the transphobia, et cetera, and wanting to do something about that and realizing, oh, hey, if we want to change, you know, these institutions, these structures, you know, these companies, we need power to do that. We cannot just like wish and pray and hope that, you know, the people in charge will do something. That we actually have to do something. And that takes a lot of us in order to make that happen. So yeah, I've definitely noticed that like really it's the marginalized folks who are leading the charge. And I think that's been the case for most social movements, right? Like you really see where that energy comes from, you know, those experiences of living oppression in one form or another. And I think what's powerful also about the labor movement is its ability to sort of like unite all of these different concerns and kind of highlight the sort of like, you know, commonalities, also the fact that like, well, it's, you know, the fact that we're workers, the fact that, you know, we don't have a say in our, you know, workplace situation that is perpetuating all of these problems. And if we work together, we can actually address all of these concerns by uniting our forces. And so that I think has also been really transformative. And I've seen, you know, a lot of people's, you know, maybe they come in with some not great attitudes sometimes about, you know, one or another marginalized group, but through that process of organizing together and realizing that we all have shared interests, they start to challenge those beliefs, right? And they start to realize, hey, actually, maybe I have more to gain, you know, by working together with everyone and kind of overcoming those biases or whatever it is that I came in with than I do by, you know, just kind of sticking with my usual way of thinking. So yeah.
I'm really glad to hear that. I often thought like a co-op, if you're sick of dealing with a very particular kind of shit, a co-op is a nice way of just being like, I don't want that anymore. You know, like you and your group of neurodivergent friends can say, we're making a space. This is a neurodivergent co-op. This is a queer co-op. You know, maybe this is a co-op of people who don't want to deal with racist white people anymore every day in the office. And so a co-op is an interesting way to kind of pull together with people and build support.
And one of the motivations when we spoke to folks was people during the pandemic started working from home remotely or hybrid. And it wasn't until they got to that point that they fully realized like how hostile their studio environment was. And then when they were told to go back, that was kind of like, no, I can't go back. I need to find a different structure to work under. So that was definitely one of those motivations that kind of percolated throughout our interviews and surveys.
Yeah, did anyone here have that experience, game industry or no? Like you tried to go back to the office and your body said, no way. No, nobody? Okay. You're all back in the office. Any questions from the audience or is there one on Zoom?
I do have one on Zoom,
Yeah.
but we'll go, well, I see one in the audience afterwards. I think this is a little bit of maybe a quicker one. The question on YouTube is, I'm curious if you collaborated with the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation throughout this project. Have they supported any game co-ops that you know of? Yes, we did collaborate with them. We had a very nice chat with them. They're one of the first people we spoke with because I think our initial survey was basically like, we just need to understand what worker co-ops are before we start asking people who are in them questions. I think it was Kay Grant there that we spoke with, and they were super supportive, gave us a lot of information, and they do seminars, they do workshops and other stuff. Perhaps folks in the co-op space can talk about how they access those resources or other resources.
So in Quebec, we actually don't really speak with the federal co-op group because since we don't have any offices or anything outside of the province, we're required to go through the provincial co-op system. So I personally don't have any experience, but I don't know if either of you have spoken.
So also know, instead there are like some local resources that are probably worth shouting out. I'm particularly thinking of Réseau Co-op. So they have like basically like co-op classes on different subjects, including like something that's supposed to take you from like having hopefully a pretty solid idea of who you want to work with and what you want to do through to like having a business plan and having, you know, being able to apply for the co-op structure through the Quebec provincial government. But I will say that like, I think they sometimes might have some courses in English, but mostly it's a French organization. But they translated everything for like my Anglophone like co-op workers very nicely. They were very kind to us.
Yeah, Rizzo said that if we get together a group of like 8 people, they'll do an English one for us. So just so everyone knows, that's an option. And I will say Kay did really help. Yeah, I to the person online, I did a long workshop with them and have emailed Kay as recently as 2 days ago to ask a follow-up question about co-ops. So I'm very grateful to them for their help.
Definitely. And just one last notice from the chat before I field that question. We can confirm that the PDFs for the comment and the white paper are officially active on the page. So if you want to download them now, you certainly can. Lynn, you had a question.
Thank you. This is great. Thank you all. I just wondered if you could explain what the advantages are. I assume there are advantages to formalizing a co-op as opposed to going through all the same work, you know, having all the same carefully thought out, all the hard work that goes into mutualizing structures and making agreements, doing everything except being registered with the government.
So one start to that answer is that it helps protect you from bad actors, like including yourselves. So like when you like formally register a co-op, you need to have bylaws. And like co-ops can also be, exploitative structures. For example, if you decided that you were going to have like a core co-op membership that all co-own the co-op, and then everyone else is a contract worker, and you don't, you just keep skirting the line where like, they work for you long enough that you pay them a certain amount, but not long enough that they get to become a co-op member. So like in your bylaws, you can include, statements that help protect your values and help protect the co-op from becoming exploitative. So I think that's probably one benefit. The other benefit that I see is, it makes you eligible for certain things and then also ineligible for certain other things. So not everyone understands what a co-op is yet. Like not all like arts grants organizations, for example, are willing to accept like a co-op, or like there has to be specific rules about whether or not you pay dividends, all these complexities, but it does make you eligible for other kinds of help, like formally through different organizations, like you're a small and medium business now, and there are small and medium business grants, for example. There are also, I don't actually think you need to have an official structure for this, but you can go through Yes Montreal and get like a business coach for like $30 a year, which is wild. So like there are, I think, those benefits, and I'll throw it to Carolyn and Celine.
Yeah, I just wanted to basically say the same thing. So Co-op Mode, my studio, isn't legally registered as a co-op, but has been in a legal transition since 2017, believe it or not. It turns out it's very complicated to turn a federal corporation into a provincial co-op. But we're very close. And the main drive behind doing that is to enshrine those protections, because right now at any time we could completely change our structure legally and not be a co-op anymore in terms of how we operate. And there's nothing that the law can do to protect that for the workers. So by registering as a formal co-op, we're making a commitment and making a statement, I think, to support this alternative mode of production and to enshrine those protections for workers forever.
Yeah, and I guess just to speak to the union angle on that, because there is, I guess, a legal certification process for that too. It's a similar sort of thing, right? Of you have the backing then of the labor board, of the government. And I think also that, there is a kind of social impact of these laws, right? Like people see, oh, this is, written down on a formal legal document. That means I have to like listen to it and respect it. There's a power behind the law, right? And so there is a certain level that, just that formal process of formalization, I think does help kind of keep things in place. It's what we found with the labor organizing side, at least, is that it's not enough on its own. The law can be helpful for some things and can act as a semi-okay shield sometimes. But it has lots of loopholes, lots of gaps. And often at the end of the day, it's like, well, if you don't have the lawyers or, the money to be able to fight a case in court, does the law really exist for you at that point, right? So that's part of also why, working with existing union federations, for example, has been very helpful because they have those legal resources, they have the money, they can help, both in terms of the education on how the law works, but also, just even providing like lawyers to help, fight these cases if there's something like a wrongful dismissal or something like that. Workers are retaliated against, for example, illegally. So I think that on the union side too, it does make a difference, but you can't just fall back on it entirely.
I just want to add also that by becoming a legally registered co-op, you're able to, I think, help other groups become co-ops much more firmly. There's a lot of lack of resources, lack of education, lack of just like, how do I do this? And to go through that process ourselves means we can help other people go through that process more easily and continue to ensure more people make co-ops if they decide to start businesses, which in of itself is a whole
Yeah, in fact, that was also part of our motivation in forming a co-op. One of my coworkers was like, okay, Game Workers Unite is curious about like what co-op formation is like. What if we just, just for fun, what if we like formed a co-op together? And we also I've been on the other side of benefiting from like that knowledge. So co-op just moved in with Lucid Tales, I think, and Lucid Tales helped Soft Chaos a lot through like those initial steps and like bylaws and like, yeah, all sorts of help. So yes, it's a big benefit.
Okay, I have a question for Michael. Oh, hi, Michael. And for anyone else who is involved in this research or anyone who has read the comic or white paper, or even skimmed through it, but for you first, Michael, was there anything in this research that surprised you?
That surprised me. Oh my goodness. I had never worked in the game industry before. And like you hear the stuff in the news and you hear that it's bad and you're like, okay, it's bad. And then you talk to people and it's like, I'm surprised at even how bad some of the stuff is. And I think one of the things I really was surprised at, because I worked in the media industry before and I had heard this rhetoric of like, we're a family when we're in a business. And I knew that existed. I didn't realize how consistent we would hear it from folks who had like worked in AAA or worked in other sorts of businesses. So kind of the consistency of the toxicity was a bit surprising to me. It shouldn't have been, but it was in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Do we have Haneen and Ermac out there? Christian? Anyone who worked, who wants to, something that surprised you? Yeah, all these hands are very welcome.
Was the back there?
Some hands, yeah. Hand again? Something that surprised you? Could be anyone who just even read through, even you skimmed through this and you thought, whoa, this is surprising.
I just raised my hand because I heard my name, but now I'm blanking on what
Yeah.
surprised me. Many things did.
So I reached out to you. Well, I mean, we were connected a while ago, and we talked about some of these questions that are here, like what are they difficult? What do co-ops stand for? Now you're looking at the research, the results of things. Is there anything here that surprises you?
At the very beginning, I was surprised by the variety of co-ops that existed, because I think I also had a very big idea of what a co-op was. So even just the detailing of what it means in reality and practicality was quite interesting to get into. Yeah, there were many more things, but can I circle back when I've thought more?
Yeah, you can come back to just put your hand up
And
when
if
you're ready.
there's anybody else I can pass.
But similarly, I did not understand all the co-op. Now I feel like I'm getting much closer, but sometimes someone will ask me a question and then I realize, oh no, I don't really understand that. Like the difficulty of like federal co-ops versus provincial co-ops, and it's better here in Canada. In the States, it's a nightmare. It's different in every state. It's just like this giant mess of complexity. But someone else, some surprises in the audience?
I have another surprise, actually. I was just looking through. I was really surprised, and when we did like the surveys, how many people thought unions were good? It was like 90%. And then when you asked them if they were interested in like joining or starting in a union, they were like, no. and it's like this cognitive dissonance in a lot of ways for various reasons. It was generally, this rhetoric was, I think unions are good, but not at my studio, which was a little surprising for me when we were going through the results.
Were those business owners or workers?
I think it was a mix of both. Yeah, it was a mix. I have the quant here, but I'm flipping through pages. It was a mix of both, but I think a lot of it was because it was more, the surveys ended up being more indie focused. So at the indies, it's like, we're not one of those studios that needs to unionize. Those studios definitely need to unionize, but we're a small to mid-sized studio. That's just not something for us.
So just for anyone thinking that their company doesn't need to unionize, much how like, co-ops good behavior exists by the grace of like, bylaws and the values that are enshrined. Like when you register, like you might have good bosses now and you might have good conditions now, but like, it doesn't take very much to change that very quickly. And like, we're seeing a lot of studios go back on promises that they made like during the I'm gonna say like, okay, we're still in a pandemic, so like, don't get me started on that. But like, that they made during like, yeah, I guess like lockdown, or like, there are all these promises about remote work, and whoops, like all of a sudden, remote work doesn't work anymore. But because of like a feeling that the CEO had, it's not based on any like concrete data. Anyway, I'll just say that like, you remain at the mercy of the bosses so long as you don't have protections.
Yeah.
I will like go after you. Okay, well, I will speak to this because I have worked almost exclusively in indie studios since I started in the games industry. I will say there are a lot of awful stories coming out of indie studios, and it is not this utopia that is free from the problems of the games industry as a whole. I think there are, obviously places where people feel, better off than maybe they would elsewhere. But like just that can very easily change. And I think also if you look at the kind of like macroeconomic dynamics of what's going on just globally, there is more and more pressure on these smaller companies to basically compete on an increasingly competitive market, which often means offloading that pressure onto the workers, right? Pushing them to work harder, reducing conditions, lowering costs, increasing profit. And that's going to have an impact, down the line. It already is starting to. We're seeing, mass layoffs happening in the games industry this year, and that's with extremely, profitable projects often. So it doesn't take much. So yeah, I think if you kind of see where things are going and you look forward, like or looking ahead, you can see why, yeah, it's very important that we organize now and not wait until things get so bad that, we're crushed and defeated and have no energy left to organize. I often have very often seen situations of workers realizing too late, oh, we should have unionized when we had a chance. Now, we're all laid off, or now it's too late, the studio's closed, etc. I've never seen anyone say, oh, we started too early. Like we really shouldn't have organized. That was a bad idea. So just, anecdotal evidence, but it's never too early to start.
Yeah, I think Carolyn nailed it. A lot of my peers are business owners or indie studio owners. I think anyone who says that, oh, I support unionization, but we don't need it here is full of shit, and they're lying to you. They're lying to themselves, or they're lying to their workers. Because I guarantee you, if you interview one of their workers, they will give you a different story every single time, because these tiny companies exist within the market and they exist within capitalism. They don't control their own financing. They don't control their own schedules. So of course, they're going to make decisions and run into conditions that are going to cause pain and suffering for people. It's inevitable. It's built into the structure of the system. So anyone who thinks that they're above the system is lying to themselves, in my opinion.
That actually ties into a question we have in the chat, and that is, how do you avoid recreating some of the same problematic work structures and dynamics within a worker co-op when you're still stuck operating within a capitalist society and the larger video game industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think co-ops can solve everything. I don't think that you can actually change some of those conditions. But one thing you can do is, by being worker owners, is that you can not be exploiting somebody. You're working for yourself, you're working together. Maybe you're exploiting yourself, but I think that's really a different relationship than exploiting somebody else.
Yeah, I think it's about harm reduction. Like, yeah, exactly. You can't precisely solve all the problems. I think, in a 3-person co-op, there's still a lot of overwork, and we have to catch ourselves. Like we have to do gut checks. We have to be like, does this align with our values? And are we is this why we formed a co-op, to overwork in this way, for example? And the answer is no, but you still wind up in that trap, or things align, and you don't want to disappoint people, or you want to do what you said you were going to do, and then it's all of a sudden you're back to those same problems. So yeah, I think like I was saying earlier, in part, we try to enshrine as much as we can. We try to bind ourselves to rules, but none of that matters when you get to the self-exploitative part. It's still very easy to exploit yourselves. So I guess like one thing that we do is like we've chosen to be like a service-based co-op, in part because we were like, okay, there's going to be feast or famine, but we're not relying on making a hit game every so many years to like sustain our co-op. So I mean, that was like a choice that we made to try and like escape that particular like timing cycle. But like, you know, there are other problems there too, and like it means that like our own projects are like there are other projects paying for our projects, and our projects may be like smaller or come out later or like take longer. But you know, we do try to like mitigate that like feast or famine, or I guess like that, yeah, that like we still have feast or famine big time, but we still try to like avoid this structure where every game has to be a hit game, for example. Yeah.
Because half the audience isn't in the games industry, can you say what you mean by feast or famine?
Oh, so if you're a freelancer, when you have to like wait between contracts, or like all of a sudden you have all the contracts because everyone's getting back to you at once and like everything's going super well, but you're, you know, working super long hours. This is the famine, and sometimes it's just like too much. No, this is the feast, sorry. It's too much feast. And then the famine part is where you're like, you're waiting to hear back on things. Yeah, you know, you're in a cycle where you're not going to get paid for a while, because of like the timing of contracts and the timing of like working with large institutions and what they're used, like when they're used to paying people and that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's what I mean by feast or famine.
Yeah, and games lend themselves to this pretty nicely because you apply for funding to someone, to an organization, a publisher, you get the funding. Everything's great. Oh no, but the funding's running out. You're trying again. You're scrambling to get more. So you're always kind of on or off. It's very rare that studios get like a happy permanent balance of funding coming in. And it's not just co-ops, it's all the games industry. This is a struggle unless you're the huge companies.
Yeah, story of our lives.
Yeah.
I do want to say one positive thing, though, that I've had in my experience is that when you have a group of people who are aligned and care about this stuff, they will challenge and we will have discussions about those sorts of things. People will bring up, hey, what we're doing right now seems to be recreating certain things that we are against in terms of our values. And by being a co-op, we're constantly in a form of reinventing and challenging ourselves through the virtue of being a group of people who care about this venture and own this venture together. So we're always aspiring, we're always trying to become better, we're always changing, we're always being challenged by the different membership. And I think that means that we're always trying to move in the right direction, even if we're not able to completely get rid of all the issues that capitalism makes us face, we're still able to tackle them in a way that's a bit more humane and a bit more forward-facing and progressive than if we were just workers and bosses at each other's throats.
We actually have a question back here, if there's a moment for that.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Oh, I just arrived here trying to get to partly understand what you're talking about. You were talking about before during the COVID, people were working like in a hybrid manner.
Yeah, we're talking about co-ops and unions. Yeah, that's right.
And I guess some of the people you're saying discovered that their office or their job where they were before was hostile.
Yes.
And I just wasn't too aware of that, but the situation, you know, currently economically, but I am very concerned, you know, and
yeah.
So I mean, I figured, like, I suppose when I was working, I guess some time ago, or generally, I felt that my employer, things, you know, you may have had to work pretty hard, but those you were respected. But of course, you know, being overworked, of course, I guess maybe it could be mean hostile. And that's all.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is hostile to be overworked. It is. I mean, this is what we're talking about. This is what has been said a few times. Is like having agency, having control is so important. I do see a question up here at the front. Can we bring the mic up?
I just do want to follow up on that last question just really quickly, because some of the ways that people express that they felt their workplaces were like hostile or not tuned to them. A lot of the neurodivergent folks just felt like it was very hard to work in those sorts of environments, to concentrate, to kind of abide by the stated schedule. And they found that when they had this hybrid or work from home option, they just simply were more productive and happier. And on the other side, like when you're in an office environment, sometimes you get little microaggressions against you all the time that when you kind of sit through them for a long period of time, you kind of they become normalized in a very bad way. And once you're out of that, you start to realize kind of all these little things that add up to big things. And then of course there are the big things as well, which we discussed in various ways. And Nikki, go ahead.
So my question is, like noticing a few of the peers here being students and us being within the space of a university. Well, and also checking out the report and the white paper and seeing some of the notes there were things about like, oh, like they never taught us about that, right? And I guess like a question or like I would like to hear you about is like, in a way, what do you wish you knew about co-ops and unions, or what you wish happened in a way about these two topics while you were students or while you were considering joining or making games and so on?
I mean, I personally wish I knew about co-ops when we were starting our game studio, because my life would be a lot easier right now on an administrative level. But actually, I learned about co-ops because of Carolyn and Joachim, who are both here, and they were just like, hey, what you're doing seems like it's within this framework. Why don't you look into that? And I was like, oh, I didn't even know this framework existed, but it totally matches with what we want to do. And I think that problem is kind of being solved now, but I really wish I understood that relationship of power and management and labor and workers and how that all broke down from early on instead of learning by trial by fire.
Yeah, I mean, I luckily went into the games industry sort of with my eyes open because I had done a bunch of community organizing essentially before that and talked to a lot of folks who were working in games. So I knew what I was getting into to some extent, but a lot of people don't. There's still a lot of kind of glamour and sort of, I don't know, ideology, I guess, around the games industry and what it's like to work there. And this idea that, you know, you get to work on your dream project and it's games, so it's fun and it's passion, so you don't have to care if you are working 80 hours a week or whatever. And that I think has been deconstructed slowly over the last, few years, but it's, it's still in progress. Definitely, but I do think the organizing that's been happening has really helped push that conversation and kind of get people thinking about those things critically. I do think, though, that schools could do a lot more on that front to make sure that people are aware of this stuff, like basic things like labor laws exist. What are your rights as a worker, right? Like most people do not get taught that, which is ridiculous. This should be really basic knowledge. What is a union? How does it work? How do you form one at whatever workplace you're in, whether you're in games or otherwise? That should be basic knowledge for anyone, who's going to be a worker, which is most of us. So yeah, I think that there's a lot more work to be done on that front for sure. I wish people who are teaching would reach out to organizations like Gamers Unite Montreal or others, unions, for example, to give talks like that. We've done that in the past with folks who've been friendly and invited us. And that's been great. And the students have loved it and absolutely been like, yes, we need more of this, please. And I'm super excited to learn. So yeah, hopefully there'll be more of that happening in the future. But yeah, I think there's a lot to learn, and it's sad that a lot of us did not learn that until we were, fully grown adults. So yeah.
Yeah, it took till grad school, but I guess technically I did learn about unions and organizing in school, also thanks to Joachim and Carolyn and other organizers. I think, and I've been able to invite people to class to talk about labor and unions and that sort of thing. That being said, the thing that I still don't know, and I think the thing that's extremely challenging for me is organizing across different legal statuses. So both as a student organizer and thinking about organizing work more generally, because people have different legal statuses, when they are students or when they might have different kinds of worker visas, I often felt that there is an extra and very valid anxiety from some of my peers about how them participating in like organizing like that would affect them, like their status, or like affect their ability to like get continued work from the people that they were relying on. And I think that's like an enormous challenge that like I wish I had a way, like I wish I knew more about like how to help like like how to protect each other against that, for example, when these like very different statuses like come into play.
There's
Can I take this for a sec? Is it okay if I'm gonna take it? Are we out of time?
You go ahead.
Are we out of time, or is there a question?
Oh, I was
have
just
a
going to follow up, but
No, please, yeah.
okay. I was just going to say, one of the things we spoke to a few folks during the interviews, and I don't actually know if they made it in the white paper because it was like a seed of a topic that I'd like to explore. And that's sort of how game design careers are kind of framed within educational institutions. And typically the dominant ideas we see are you're going to go into AAA pipeline, or you're going to be an indie auteur kind of game maker, which are kind of exploitative narratives in similar but different ways. And there's not a lot of space really allowed for other discussions such as co-ops and unions or like alternative paths. So I think one of the things I'd really like to see is just, you know, more labor education in these sort of game programs, more like different paths you can take and more awareness of kind of the state of the industry.
Yeah, let's do it. There's a question back there, but I want to do a quick exercise. So what I'd like to do before we get that question is, people online, if you can write in the chat, I just like people to think about one thing about your work right now that you want to change. The work that you do, one thing that you want it to be different. You can say your name first too, so people know who you are.
Okay. My name is Henrique. I wish that the work that I do is less isolated from other folks.
Less isolated. And you can also just go pass by waving me away.
4 days a week would be nice.
Guaranteed work from home. Guaranteed work from home.
I'm my own boss. Sometimes I wish I had a better boss than myself.
Just exciting projects.
I'm unemployed right now, so finding a job.
Yeah, more stable, you know, more security, I guess.
I'm sort of my own boss, and I need to give myself more time off.
I usually have to work with teams in Europe and Australia, and I wish I could have a job where we had the same working hours.
Yeah, actually, I'm my own boss too, so I'm looking for more work actually.
Less work, more money.
Probably more balance in the amount of work that different people are doing.
I actually work at co-op, so I'm pretty happy with my with my work. I wish it was easier to get money from platform holders.
Yeah, I mean, you know, security, stability, and a real stake in the stuff that I work on.
I wish the things that I love the most didn't pay the least, and the things that I love the least didn't pay the most.
Pay should probably increase to match the cost of living.
I guess I'd like to work somewhere where hiring and firing felt a little bit more fair.
Recently unemployed, I think I wish my personhood was attached to the value of my work, that my work wasn't interchangeable across persons.
I think a bit more clarity on like decision making between the different roles.
More pay and less reliance on grants.
Fewer layers of management and being more involved in decision making and planning.
So the company I work for just went through layoffs, so I wish that didn't happen.
Yeah.
currently not working, so I would like income, I guess.
More collective envisioning in our team of where we're going, imagining where we're going.
Well, I actually used to work as a freelancer before working here, and I wish it was more money transparency when it comes to talking with your clients and budgeting.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm pretty content here.
You're welcome to.
Oh, yes, less feast and famine.
Yeah, I feel that one. I do a lot of freelance work and it's rough sometimes. And just, respect in the workplace would be great. More of that.
Yeah, like was said earlier, I wish we just didn't have to hustle so hard for funding.
Well, I'm in academia, so I guess I wish there was less labor that was expected to be free all the time.
I wanted to do this because I feel like when we're talking about work, it's easy to forget that this is grounded in us and our needs and who we are and our dignity as human beings. And we actually have a right to have needs and to have our needs met. And these are not unreasonable asks. I heard things that were very reasonable. But yeah, I can bring us back to the conversation, but I like the ground in this.
We have a question online from Eileen Holoka. When I will plug Weird Ghosts here. Because Weird Ghosts is a lovely funding agency that actually has special, has co-ops in mind and has sustainability in mind for game studios. And Eileen says, if there's time, I'd love to hear the panelists talk about what tips they would give for folks who are starting co-op studios, what to avoid, and how to clearly define their values. Thanks all.
I think something that I've noticed and that I want to see more of is an emphasis on process. I think a lot of people operate on vibes, and I get that because that's how we used to operate too, especially when you're starting out. You're just like, well, I just want to do something and I don't want anyone to tell me how to do that. But as we've grown, as we've tried to be sustainable, and as we've tried to make a workplace that is very meaningful to people, process comes up repeatedly as a thing that we need to be much better at, something that we have to establish. And as a co-op, process is intrinsic to our operation as a co-op. We used to meet every quarter. So every 3 months, we'd have a meeting where we would discuss everything in the business going on. And now we meet monthly because the workers wanted more transparency and more process and less time apart before we were meeting as a collective. And something I've noticed with a lot of younger co-ops that I've been consulting with or talking to is that they have their bylaws and they have their status as a co-op, but then they don't ever really engage with that process again, because making games themselves is so difficult. It's so challenging. It's something that you have to spend a lot of your energy on, that who wants to do the boring admin stuff? But that boring admin stuff actually goes a really long way towards providing the security that a co-op can bring to its members. Without that boring stuff being taken seriously by everybody, it really, essentially, you end up recreating a lot of the same power structures and blinders that you would have anywhere else. So really taking those things seriously from early on and engaging with them is pretty critical, in my opinion.
So firstly, in Quebec, at least, you need 3 people to start a co-op, and who you start a co-op with matters a lot. So, it's not like a casual thing. I think choosing who you're going to start with, without getting into the gross, we're a family side of businesses. One of my coworkers always compares it to a marriage. We are in a legally binding arrangement with financial stakes and reputational stakes. We have hitched our wagons together. We knew each other for a long time before we did that. And I think that was valuable to us. Like, you know, I'm not saying that you also have to know your people for like a decade or more, but really like be aware of who you're entering into this contract with. We also do things like we have like group therapy together. We do like a monthly group therapy. You know, that really helps us, like, you know, like kind of like just air things out as often as possible. You know, we worked a lot on our like communication together and like how our different like neurodivergencies fit together. Like I'm a very like anxious person. So like if things are not getting done, like it really makes me anxious to like run up against a deadline. But like, you know, my coworkers both have ADHD and they're like fueled by the adrenaline of like that last minute work. And so we make compromises. I think another bit of advice is like definitely like talk to other co-ops and talk to like make use of all those services. And like Salim was saying, you know, there's some stuff that like may seem boring or like you don't really need to talk about it, but like talking about process and like talking about values and going through all those like those exercises that like, you know, that they'll like tell you to do when you're forming a business, like, you know, this is for me to pay for parking, but it can wait a little while. Yeah, so like going through the exercises of like value formation and making sure that you're all on the same page about those things is really worthwhile later on and makes a lot of other things like much more smooth. And when you have those pillars too, you can make decisions. Like you can decide, does this align with the things that we've said that we want, or doesn't it? That's been enormously helpful for us.
Also, fundamentally, the kind of work that we do in a creative industry involves a lot of conflict. And I think having really clear conflict resolution, like policies or bylaws or processes is really valuable. It's very valuable to do therapy so that you understand how you deal with conflict in of itself. But it's really important to discuss those things with your partners very early on so that when conflict does happen, you have a way to deal with it. And it's not a surprise, it's not a shock, it's not something that's extremely destabilizing, because it can be.
Who here has good conflict resolution skills? Anyone here? Pretty good. Any resources to recommend from Salim or anyone in the audience? Good resources?
I just intuit everything through experience. Don't listen to me.
So for co-ops, there is a resource called Co in Montreal. Like they have like a wide variety of workshops and like some like mediators and things like that. So that could be useful. I do recommend like both personal therapy and group therapy. But like, yeah, so there are mediators, there are people that can help with like putting structures in place as well. Again, like Rezo Co-op was very helpful for us. Yeah, so I guess those are two resources that I know of.
That's great. Yeah, personal therapy is very important. But I'm seeing a question back, but like when we know that personal therapy these days is $150 an hour or something. And so I don't know where we're going to get to. We're going to have to find some resources that are not people or like weird AI machines that are spitting generic advice at us. And one more thing before we get to the question, I just feel like, Salim, I want to emphasize something that you've been talking about, which is structure. Having structure is so important. One of the first things that I read when doing this research was I reread The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Does anyone know this?
Yeah.
Yeah, this one. Anyone want to describe it? I don't want to. I hate talking. I don't know why I always end up with a microphone.
I'll do it. I'm gonna.
Thank you.
I'm gonna do it for you, Marie. Only for you. So okay. So The Tyranny of Structurelessness is like a feminist paper, I think from the 70s or 80s, that describes how soft power structures will always form regardless of whether you formalize them. So basically, instead of letting those soft power structures like take the place of actual agreed upon structure, you should talk about structure and form structures.
Beautiful. Thanks, Jess. Yeah, thanks, Jess, and thanks, Joe Freeman, for Tyranny of Structural. It's very short. You can read it online. But there was a question back there.
Yeah, another question. I just want to say I work at Coco, so if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Can we come to you? Do we have to make co-ops? Because we will make co-ops if that's
It's not just for co-ops, also community organizations, we support. Yeah.
Great.
And we have a question up front here. Oh, and in the middle, lots of questions.
Yeah, question I've been hanging on for a little while, so it might not be exactly relevant, but I was wondering how qualifications work in a co-op or games worker structure. Because if the goal is no longer finding the ultimate skill for the ultimate, money and constantly finding the best, better qualifications, how does that change in a co-op structure? Qualifications. Or does it?
Could you expand on that a little bit more, like what you mean by
well,
qualifications?
I guess I'm thinking of if it's a lot more informal and you're forming it with people that you know well, and you're not looking to be constantly expanding, do you get to be more picky and choosy about qualifications, or do you care less about qualifications?
I think you always care about what people bring to a co-op, and as a group of people, we always talk about how a person that we might hire might influence and change the space and what we're looking for. And honestly, we're just trying to survive, so qualifications are really important to trying to survive in a very complex industry. So I think it's actually really critical. And but fundamentally, it starts first with the person and not their qualifications. Like, is this a person whose vibe matches, their politics make sense with what we're trying to achieve? Are their goals aligned with our goals? Do we think it's going to be something that everyone will mutually benefit from? And from there, we then start talking about qualifications and what will they bring to the actual work? Because fundamentally, it is a workplace at the end of the day. And I think that's something that some people can lose sight of and try to make co-ops seem as this magical, amazing utopia where you get to hang out with your friends and make cool stuff. And it's no, we're just trying to survive like everybody else is. So what you actually bring to the work is as important as anything else. That's just my perspective though.
So for our co-op, I will say that we all had to bring multiple skills, and there were other skills that we didn't have that we had to learn. And we had to negotiate who is going to be responsible for those skills based on not only who was capable of them, but who had the emotional capacity for them, and then the ability to take it on with other workloads. So I guess it kind of depends. I don't think you need formal degrees, although we do have them. I think that helps from an outside perspective. If somebody's just looking at your website for 5 seconds and they're oh, these people somebody else said that they can say what they say they can do. I think that's helpful from a business perspective. But knowing that you have the skills to accomplish the tasks that you need to do for either for yourselves if you're getting funded through different arts grants, or for clients that you can deliver on what you promise on at a pretty high level is pretty important reputationally. But it doesn't have to come necessarily from formal education or that sort of stuff, I don't think.
Yeah, in particular about that point about formal education is what sort of made me start thinking about this, right? Because so much these days people are saying, oh, a bachelor's degree doesn't mean anything, or oh, a master's degree doesn't mean anything, or it's all portfolio, right? And it's interesting to know that that's different and the same in these different structures. Thank you.
Definitely. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'll speak just to the game worker, because we don't really have qualifications for being a member of Game Workers Union Montreal. You just have to work in the games industry or be a worker in general, right? So we don't accept bosses. So I guess that's one qualification. You can't be a boss or a manager. But yeah, it's a democratic organization of workers in the games industry. So we're open to everyone, including folks who are students, folks who are unemployed, anyone who wants to get involved in making change and is in the position of being a worker. So yeah.
I just wanted to add, when it comes to formal qualifications, at least in our case, we rarely care about that kind of stuff. really is like, if it's there, it's like cool. If it's not there, but your work shows something that's really valuable or interesting, that's also cool.
And I'll add that I've been doing some research on games labor specifically in the gig economy space. And I was reading some very depressing literature that I can't remember who wrote it exactly, but they said, as soon as a practice becomes qualification based, it makes the worker replaceable in some ways. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because I think you need the BA and the portfolio if you want to go to these studios now, and you're kind of treated as one among like a large pool of candidates that are roughly equivalent. And that's kind of the opposite of what we heard when we talked to co-ops, especially. They were like, yes, I mean, we want people with skills, but no one's replaceable. Everyone's unique. They have their own kind of take on like game design and labor.
Which echoes something someone wanted in the audience. They wanted from their job to be a human, not replaceable. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, quick thing, myths. I want to make sure we get these myths. Michael, can you tell us the myths of co-ops, or just tell us 2 myths?
Oh my goodness.
It's page 26.
Thank you for giving me the page.
I want people to leave knowing that these are not true.
I think the first one's super interesting. So one of the big myths about co-ops is that all the hierarchies within a co-op are completely flat. And that's not necessarily the case. And maybe I will let the co-op people elaborate on that a little bit. Yeah, maybe let's start with that. Let's talk about like this idea that it's just a completely flat structure, which is not true.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of appeal to that flat structure, especially coming from places that have very, very top-down structures. But for us, is the tyranny question, right? It was, well, we know that there are power structures, there's social power structures at our studio. So instead of shying away from that, we just made them explicit. And we have a 2-tier structure at Co-op where our business itself and the operation of the company, of the studio, is flat and transparent, and we meet monthly and vote monthly on decisions on that. However, our games have a top-down structure of hierarchy where we form a team, and then that team votes within itself to create who is the game director, who has the final call, and who's the art director, who's the tech lead, etc. And those are very firm hierarchies that help us continue to like always have momentum on production. But what's really great about doing that kind of formalization is that you can also challenge that structure at any time. If you're finding somebody is wielding their power in a way that doesn't feel right to you, we have processes in place to challenge those power structures and to reconfigure them if necessary. So I think one thing that we do is also that we have a flat salary structure. So everybody is paid the same at our studio, regardless of their experience. That is not intrinsic to co-ops. It's something that we felt was important to us. And we've recently introduced a graded bonus structure because even though everybody is paid the same and works roughly the same, we found that in our development, there were certain people who were taking on higher responsibility. And it felt weird not to compensate that. And so the team decided that they didn't want to have different salary bands for like directors and leads versus production workers. And so we decided to have a flat salary with a graded bonus structure depending on your responsibilities and et cetera. So there's so many ways to organize a co-op. It doesn't have to be flat, but a lot of places, especially a lot of small studios, when you're like 3 or 4 people, it's much simpler to maintain a flat structure that's equitable. Whereas when you're at the size of like 10 to 15 people, it starts to really break down upon social hierarchies. And if those aren't examined and deconstructed, you will have a lot of abuse of power.
So I think Salim broke it down really nicely. We do something similar, like on a per project basis. We have like kind of like, I guess like the project captain or like the person who's ultimately like in charge of certain decisions a lot of the time. And like, but yeah, like in practice with a team our size, you know, we do consult each other on decisions, but like setting out like who is doing what on a project is just good project management, and also allows us to like skill share too. So if there's something that somebody wants to learn, depending on the project stakes and like who is like has the bandwidth to help out, you can you know, switch things up and like give somebody a role that they don't usually get that they want to learn, for example. But yeah, like, you know, you decide at the end of the day, like you are making the rules for your co-op. There are certain legal things that must be in place, but everything else is up to you, like including, yeah, like, is there a salary band or isn't there? Is like, yeah, how decisions are made, all of that, you get to decide.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add quickly, when I've talked to people about worker co-ops, the things I've emphasized are not, you know, is it flat or not, but is it democratic? You know, do the people who participate have a say in decisions, get to, you know, elect their leaders? You don't get to do that in the normal business. You don't get to decide who your managers are. They are not democratic. But there's that, and then there's the shared ownership question, which I think was brought up earlier, but that is also really critical, right? So you are benefiting from your own labor, and it's not going somewhere else to someone else.
That's a really good, that was a great myth. Yeah, so, but let's do a union myth too, because I feel like we're almost out of time.
Yes.
And so if someone has a question that's burning inside you in your heart, you should let that stew right now while we do a union myth.
I do like this first myth because I think I have heard it a lot in my life. And this idea that unions are an outside entity or organization that wants to invade your company in some way.
It's page 38 for union myths.
I guess I can start on that. Definitely have heard that one a lot. Bosses love to push that one. It is, yeah, I mean, it is a myth. It is essentially, I mean, we've talked about this even earlier on in this discussion, right? Like a union is the workers. It's the workers coming together to solve their problems collectively. And so there is not an outside entity. It is you and your coworkers deciding to do something. And maybe you can get, resources or support from a federation, which is also just other groups of workers who have decided to do the same thing at their workplaces. But yeah, I think ultimately it's something that benefits the bosses because it kind of scares people and makes them think, it's going to change our nice, happy family structure. Or just, I just don't know much about unions, so it's scary because it's an unknown. But I think once you realize that, and once you start getting involved yourself, especially, that's when you really realize, no, it's us who is making these decisions and making these things happen, and it's our victories when we win. So yeah.
Yeah. So were there any, yeah, because we're really at the wire of time. So if there was a question that was just sitting inside, burning its way out of your mouth, anyone? Oh, yeah, there is one. Oh, I'm glad I asked. There's one up at the front.
Right up front.
Yeah.
So far, we've talked a lot about studios and companies and organization like that. But I feel like it was mentioned briefly, the gig economy. Like it seems nowadays, no one has a permanent contract. No one works for one company. We shuffle around and with contract to contract. Like, can there be a union for that? What sort of option are there for these folks?
I guess I can start. I've got the microphone. That's a great question. And I think that is something that we're actually seeing more and more organizing happening in those spaces, like just in the last few years. But I think it is something that, traditional unions or existing unions are really going to have to tackle, right? Because the realities of work are changing. But I think we've seen really positive signs. You're seeing, Uber workers organizing, for example, DoorDash. A lot of these gig economy workers are actually coming together and forming organizations and saying like, well, hey, maybe, labor law doesn't apply to us, but we're still going to fight for the changes that we want to see. And they're winning, right? They're making victories happen. I think I'm forgetting the details of this, but there was some recent news about, I think, minimum wage increases for gig economy workers in the US somewhere. And yeah, that was one through worker organizing, right? So I think it's going to become more and more important that folks who are, maybe freelancers or contractors also think of themselves as workers and as part of this labor movement and get involved. I also, have the personal experience of organizing at Vodio, which was was largely freelancers, I believe. The employees were the minority, and it was a fully remote workplace. And we still managed to organize, found a nice little kind of loophole in US labor law, or the way that it works currently, where we were essentially able to win voluntary recognition, which means, the boss agreed through a lot of pressure on our end to recognize the union and include the freelancers in the unit as part of that agreement. So there are ways of kind of like creatively using labor law to your advantage. Or changing the laws, if the ones that are there don't work for you, you can change them. It takes a lot of organizing and a lot of building up that power and, making that pressure happen, but it's possible. And I think we are building to, in that direction. So I think we're going to see positive changes on that front in the near future. So, yeah.
I love that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think we have time for one last question. I see a hand up at the back.
Did everyone get a comic who wanted one? I know some people came in later. There are comics. Yes.
All right, so the question is about the film and television industry, which has a lot of very strong unions in all parts of the production, actors, writers, post-production, special effects, whatever, editors. So I don't know if there are any parallels with the gaming industry and how unions can support more contract workers as they do in the film and television industry.
I think I'll just say really quickly, at a high level, I think when we were speaking to folks, they're realizing that the struggles are shared between these industries and they're crossing over more than they ever have before. So we're starting to see a lot more like early solidarity and actually people reaching out to these umbrella unions to kind of get involved with them. So there's definitely some progress in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, the industries, this is part of the kind of consolidation wave, I guess, that's happening or has been happening in capitalism for a while now of, the big corporations at the top are owning more and more different kinds of companies. And so, increasingly, the bosses that we're organizing against are the same, whether you're in tech, whether you're in, TV and film, whether you're in games. So yeah, I think that kind of coming together of movements is definitely happening. I think just recently, the voice actors in the games industry under SAG-AFTRA voted to authorize a strike. So it doesn't mean they're going on strike, but they have that option if they, if negotiations don't go well. And I think it's been really interesting to see how that's been received differently this time around than the last time that happened. Because last time there was, unfortunately, I think a lot of business owners who kind of tried to pit workers in the games industry against the voice actors who were going on strike and sort of be like, well, they're getting all these things and you don't get them, so you shouldn't support them. Whereas now I think it's more like, hey, they're getting all these things, we should fight to get those too. We should be part of that movement. So yeah, I think that has actually really transformed again in the last few years, which has been really positive to see. Yeah, I don't know, their view.
I think I heard yesterday that there's a video game studio that just unionized under IATSE, which is part of that whole structure. So yeah, I think that's even a possibility, right? That there is so much crossover and so much shared, so many shared struggles and kinds of labor issues that if these structures are already in place, then maybe game studios can benefit from allying with them or organizing with them.
Also, in my experience, one of the biggest union busting myths that I've heard in games is that well, you can't look to television and film to unionize because they're all standardized. The processes, everyone knows what a camera is. You're not reinventing a camera every time you make a movie, but in games, you're reinventing the wheel every day. And I think that that's totally a bullshit thing that they try to use to actually make you not pay attention to the real issues that are happening, because you absolutely can look at what television and film are doing and the ways that they're organized and draw direct parallels to how video games are produced. The fact that we don't have as much standardization doesn't mean that we can't still create conditions for the labor that goes into that to follow those models. It's a huge myth that bosses like to throw out.
Yeah, and often when bosses talk about that, oh, it's really standardized, it's not flexible enough. What they mean by flexibility is precarity, right? They mean like, oh, your job could change at any time. You can add new responsibilities onto your plate and, you don't have any say in that. So I think, yeah, it's very good to take that kind of language critically and not just accept it at face value. Because yeah, unions are changing and adapting all the time also, right? Like we're seeing now some of the victories that have been won by WGA, for example, around AI use. And that's, that relatively new technology, streaming, all of this stuff, like these industries are changing as well. So I think it's also, yeah, it's something that we can adapt to as a labor movement.
I could keep this conversation going for another 2 hours, but I do realize it's 6 o'clock, so it's probably time to wind down. So thank you everyone at the table, Salim, Carolyn, and Jess for joining us today. Always lovely to co-host with you, Marie. I want to thank all the participants we had for this research project, all of our collaborators. Fourth Space folks, thank you so much. It was so easy to come here and just do the presentation. And just thanks everybody for showing up. And if you want to chat with us, you can reach out through email. You can see the documents online on the GAIN website, and we're always happy to chat about this more in the future. So thanks.
Well, thank you once again to everyone who joined us today, both here in person and those of you who joined us online for this incredible conversation. Thank you again to our panelists and our hosts. We're going to go ahead, close up the Zoom and also the space, but just to remind you, this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit it or share it. Once again, thank you for joining us for this full week of the Commons here at Fourth Space. All right, everyone, thank you so much and have a fantastic weekend.